I'm Samantha, 25 years old, and 3 months ago my grandparents died in a car accident, leaving me a $26 million inheritance that completely bypassed my parents. When I refused to share the money they felt entitled to, they disowned me, kicked me out of the house, and told everyone I was selfish and ungrateful. What they didn't know was that my grandparents had recorded a video explaining exactly why they chose me over my parents, and when I played it at the family funeral reception, the look of horror on my parents' faces as everyone heard their own words quoted back to them was absolutely devastating. Before we dive into this incredible story about inheritance, family greed, and the perfect justice that followed, I need your predictions. What do you think my grandparents said in that video that was so damaging to my parents? How do you think the family reacted when they learned the truth about why I was chosen over my own parents? Drop your thoughts in the comments and smash that like button because this story shows exactly what happens when people's true character gets exposed in the most public way possible. Subscribe because the way this family drama unfolded is pure karma. My paternal grandparents, Harold and Margaret Chin, had been the foundation of love and stability in my life from the moment I was born. While my parents, Robert and Linda Chin, were busy climbing corporate ladders and accumulating material possessions, my grandparents provided the emotional support, moral guidance, and unconditional love that shaped who I became as a person. Harold had built a successful manufacturing business from nothing, starting with a small machine shop in the 1960s and gradually expanding into a multi-million-dollar operation that employed hundreds of people and served clients across the entire Midwest. Margaret had been his business partner in every sense, managing the financial aspects of the company while Harold focused on operations and client relationships. Together, they had created not just financial wealth but a legacy of integrity, hard work, and community responsibility that extended far beyond their business success. They donated generously to local charities, supported educational initiatives, and treated their employees with the kind of respect and loyalty that had become rare in modern business relationships. But more importantly to me, they had been the grandparents who attended every school play, celebrated every achievement, and provided guidance during every difficult period of my childhood and young adulthood. When my parents were too busy with work obligations to attend my high school graduation, my grandparents were there with flowers and proud tears. When I struggled with college decisions, they spent hours listening to my concerns and helping me think through options that would align with my values and interests. The contrast between my grandparents' parenting style and my parents' approach had been obvious to everyone who knew our family. Harold and Margaret believed in leading by example, teaching through patient guidance, and showing love through consistent presence and attention. Robert and Linda believed in achieving success through competition, accumulating wealth through aggressive ambition, and demonstrating love through expensive gifts rather than emotional availability. My parents had always been dismissive of what they considered my grandparents' old-fashioned values and inefficient approaches to business and life. They criticized Harold and Margaret's generous treatment of employees, their conservative financial management, and their focus on community relationships rather than profit maximization. "Your grandparents don't understand modern business realities," Dad would say when I expressed admiration for their company culture and ethical standards. "They're leaving money on the table with their soft approach to employee management and their excessive charitable giving." Mom would add, "Harold and Margaret are sweet people, but they lack the killer instinct necessary for real success in today's competitive environment." Their business succeeded despite their approach, not because of it. But what my parents failed to understand was that Harold and Margaret's success had been built on exactly the principles they dismissed as outdated. The company's reputation for integrity and reliability had created client loyalty that lasted for decades. The generous treatment of employees had resulted in minimal turnover and exceptional productivity. The community relationships had provided support networks and business opportunities that aggressive competitors couldn't access. More importantly, my grandparents' approach to family relationships had created bonds based on genuine love and mutual respect rather than obligation and expectation. They had invested in relationships with their grandchildren not because they expected something in return, but because they understood that family connections were more valuable than any financial accumulation. My relationship with Harold and Margaret had deepened as I became an adult and began making my own decisions about values, career goals, and life priorities. Unlike my parents, who constantly pressured me to pursue more lucrative career options and criticized my interests in social work and community development, my grandparents encouraged me to follow my passions and supported my decisions to prioritize meaning over money. "Samantha, dear," Margaret had told me during one of our weekly coffee dates, "the most important thing in life isn't how much money you make or how many possessions you accumulate. It's how much good you do in the world and how many people you help along the way." Harold had agreed. "We've been blessed with financial success, but our real wealth comes from the relationships we've built and the positive impact we've had on other people's lives. That's what we hope you'll remember when you're making decisions about your own future." Their guidance had influenced my choice to pursue a degree in social work, despite my parents' objections and predictions that I would struggle financially and waste my potential in a field they considered unrewarding and impractical. But Harold and Margaret had celebrated my career choice, understanding that my desire to help others reflected the values they had instilled in me throughout my childhood. They had supported my education financially and emotionally, attending my graduation from social work school with the same pride they had shown at every milestone in my life. What I didn't know until after their deaths was that Harold and Margaret had been quietly documenting my parents' attitudes toward money, family relationships, and moral priorities for years. They had been concerned about Robert and Linda's increasing focus on material accumulation and their decreasing attention to family relationships and community responsibilities. They had watched my parents prioritize career advancement over family time, expensive possessions over meaningful experiences, and social status over genuine relationships. They had observed Robert and Linda's dismissive treatment of relatives who were less financially successful and their transactional approach to family relationships that seemed to measure love in terms of financial benefit. Most significantly, they had noticed my parents' growing assumptions about inheritance and their expectations that Harold and Margaret's wealth would eventually support Robert and Linda's lifestyle ambitions and retirement plans. The assumptions were never stated directly, but they were obvious in comments about family money, future security, and what we'll be able to afford when the time comes. Harold and Margaret had been troubled by these attitudes because they conflicted with the values they had tried to instill in their son and daughter-in-law. They believed that wealth should be earned through hard work and good choices, not inherited as an entitlement. They thought that family relationships should be based on love and respect, not on expectations of financial benefit. As their health began declining and they started serious estate planning, Harold and Margaret made decisions about their legacy that reflected their observations about their family members' characters and values. They wanted their wealth to go to someone who would use it responsibly and in ways that honored the principles they had lived by throughout their lives. The decisions they made would soon reveal just how accurately they had assessed their son and daughter-in-law's character, and how much their careful observations about family dynamics had influenced their final wishes about who should inherit the wealth they had spent a lifetime building. The funeral for Harold and Margaret Shen was held on a crisp October morning at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, where they had been active members for over 30 years. The sanctuary was filled to capacity with family members, business associates, employees from their manufacturing company, and dozens of community members whose lives had been touched by my grandparents' generosity and kindness. The service was a beautiful celebration of lives well lived, filled with stories about Harold and Margaret's business ethics, community involvement, and devotion to family. Speaker after speaker described their integrity, their generosity, and their genuine care for other people's well-being and success. My parents played their roles perfectly during the funeral, accepting condolences graciously and speaking movingly about their love and respect for Harold and Margaret. To outside observers, they appeared to be grieving children who had lost beloved parents and appreciated mentors. But I had noticed subtle signs throughout the preceding days that suggested Robert and Linda were thinking about more than just their loss. There had been whispered conversations about estate planning, casual questions about Harold and Margaret's financial advisors, and comments about taking care of practical matters that indicated their thoughts were already turning toward inheritance issues. The will reading was scheduled for 3 days after the funeral, taking place in the conference room of Peterson, Matthews and Associates, the law firm that had handled Harold and Margaret's legal affairs for over 20 years. The meeting included my parents, my Aunt Sarah, Dad's sister, my Uncle Tom, Mom's brother, myself, and Harold's longtime business partner James Fletcher. Attorney William Peterson, who had known my grandparents for decades, began the session by expressing his condolences and explaining that Harold and Margaret had been very thoughtful and deliberate in their estate planning, working for months to ensure their final wishes would be clearly documented and legally binding. Harold and Margaret wanted to make sure their estate would be distributed in ways that reflected their values and supported family members who they believed would honor their legacy, Mr. Peterson explained before beginning to read the specific provisions of the will. The initial bequests were predictable and generous: substantial donations to their church, the local hospital, and several educational charities they had supported for years. James Fletcher received Harold's share of the manufacturing business, along with provisions ensuring that current employees would be protected and company operations would continue according to the ethical standards Harold and Margaret had established. Various personal items and sentimental possessions were distributed among family members, with each recipient receiving something meaningful that reflected their relationship with Harold and Margaret. I was deeply moved to learn that I would inherit Margaret's jewelry collection and Harold's library, both of which held special significance because of the time we had spent together discussing the stories behind various pieces. But the major financial provisions of the will created a silence in the room that seemed to last forever, though it was probably only a few seconds. To my granddaughter Samantha Chen, Mr. Peterson read, who has consistently demonstrated the values of integrity, compassion, and service to others that Margaret and I have tried to live by throughout our lives, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all financial assets, real estate holdings, and investment portfolios, currently valued at approximately $26 million. The words seemed to hang in the air as everyone processed what had just been announced. My parents stared at Mr. Peterson as if he had made a mistake, apparently unable to believe that Harold and Margaret's entire fortune had been left to me rather than to their own son. "There must be some error," Dad said finally, his voice tight with shock and growing anger. "My parents wouldn't have left everything to Samantha while cutting out their own children." Mr. Peterson consulted his documents carefully before responding, "Mr. Chen, I can assure you there is no error. Your parents were very clear about their wishes, and they spent considerable time discussing the reasoning behind their decisions. Mom's reaction was more emotional and immediate: "This is impossible. Harold and Margaret loved all of us equally. They would never have made such an unequal distribution of their estate. Someone must have influenced them improperly." The accusation that I had somehow manipulated my grandparents was both hurtful and revealing about how my parents viewed family relationships and inheritance rights. In their minds, the only explanation for Harold and Margaret's decision was external manipulation rather than independent assessment of their family members' characters and values. "Mrs. Chen," Mr. Peterson replied firmly, "I can assure you that Harold and Margaret made these decisions independently, after months of careful consideration and discussion. They were of sound mind and under no external pressure when they finalized their estate planning." Aunt Sarah, who had been silent during the initial shock, asked the question everyone was thinking: "Bill, did Harold and Margaret explain their reasoning for this distribution? Did they give any indication why they chose to leave everything to Samantha rather than dividing the estate among all the family members?" Mr. Peterson's answer would prove to be even more significant than the inheritance announcement itself. "Yes, they did explain their reasoning, and they wanted to ensure that their decision would be understood by everyone affected by it. Harold and Margaret recorded a video message that they asked me to share with the family if there were any questions about their estate planning decisions." The mention of a video message created another profound silence in the room, as everyone realized that Harold and Margaret had anticipated confusion or objection to their will and had prepared explanations that would be delivered in their own voices after their deaths. They specifically requested that this video be shown only if family members questioned their estate planning decisions or if there were disputes about their wishes, Mr. Peterson continued. "Given the reactions I've heard today, I believe this would be an appropriate time to share their message." Dad and Mom exchanged glances that suggested they were both worried about what Harold and Margaret might have said about their son and daughter-in-law in a video they had never seen or approved. "We'd like to see the video," Dad said, though his tone suggested he was dreading what they might hear. As Mr. Peterson prepared to play Harold and Margaret's final message to their family, I felt a mixture of anticipation and sadness about hearing my grandparents' voices again so soon after their deaths. But I also felt curious about what they had felt was important enough to record for posterity, and what observations about our family they had wanted to preserve and share. The video that would soon play in that conference room would explain not just the reasoning behind their inheritance decisions, but also reveal the depth of their understanding about their family members' true characters and values. Most importantly, it would demonstrate that their choice to leave their entire fortune to me had been based on years of careful observation and moral assessment rather than favoritism or manipulation. The video began with Harold and Margaret sitting together in their familiar living room, the same setting where they had hosted countless family gatherings and where I had spent hundreds of hours during visits throughout my childhood. They looked directly into the camera with the same warmth and dignity they had always displayed, but their expressions carried a seriousness that indicated the importance of the message they were about to deliver. "If you're watching this video," Harold began, "it means that our estate planning decisions have created questions or concerns among our family members, and Bill Peterson has determined that our explanations would be helpful for everyone to hear." Margaret continued, "We want to begin by saying that we love our son Robert and our daughter-in-law Linda, and we hope they will understand that our decisions about inheritance were made with careful consideration of what would be best for everyone involved." The diplomatic opening was typical of my grandparents' approach to difficult conversations, always beginning with affirmation and love before addressing more challenging topics. But I could see my parents tensing as they waited for the explanation that would justify their exclusion from Harold and Margaret's estate. "Over the past several years," Harold continued, "we have observed attitudes and behaviors among our family members that have influenced our decisions about how our wealth should be distributed after our deaths." Margaret's portion of the explanation was more specific and ultimately more damaging to my parents' reputations. "We have been concerned about Robert and Linda's relationship with money and their understanding of family responsibility and moral obligation." She paused briefly before continuing with observations that would prove devastating. "We have heard Robert and Linda make comments about their inheritance and what they'll be able to afford when we're gone, that suggests they view our wealth as their entitlement rather than our achievement." The video continued with Harold providing specific examples. "During last year's Christmas dinner, Robert mentioned that he and Linda were planning to buy a vacation home in Florida once the inheritance comes through. At Easter, Linda commented that they wouldn't need to worry about retirement savings because Harold and Margaret's money will take care of everything." I remembered both of those conversations, and I could see from my parents' faces that they remembered them too. What had seemed like casual family discussion to them had apparently been interpreted by Harold and Margaret as evidence of presumptuous attitudes about inheritance that conflicted with their values about earning wealth and managing money responsibly. But the video's most damaging revelations were yet to come. Margaret continued with observations about my parents' treatment of other family members and their attitudes toward people with less financial success. "We have been troubled by Robert and Linda's dismissive treatment of family members who have not achieved the same level of financial success," Margaret explained. "We have heard them make disparaging comments about Sarah's career as a teacher and Tom's work as a social worker, suggesting that their choices to prioritize service over salary are somehow inferior or foolish." Harold added, "More concerning to us has been their attitude toward our employees and community relationships. Robert has repeatedly criticized our excessive charitable giving and our overly generous treatment of company workers, suggesting that we are naive about business realities and inefficient in our financial management." The video included direct quotes that my parents had apparently forgotten they had made, but that Harold and Margaret had remembered with painful clarity. "Robert told us that we were leaving money on the table by treating employees too well and that our charitable contributions were tax write-offs that could be better utilized for family benefit." Margaret's voice carried sadness as she continued, "Linda has made similar comments about our community involvement, suggesting that our time and resources would be better invested in building wealth for the family, rather than giving money away to strangers." The accuracy of these quotes was obvious from my parents' expressions, which showed recognition and embarrassment as they heard their own words repeated back to them months after the conversations had occurred. But the video's most powerful segment focused on their observations about my character and values compared to my parents' priorities and attitudes. "In contrast," Harold said, "we have watched our granddaughter Samantha choose a career path that prioritizes helping others over financial gain, despite criticism and pressure from her parents to pursue more lucrative opportunities." Margaret smiled as she spoke about me. "Samantha has consistently demonstrated the values of service, integrity, and compassion that we have tried to live by throughout our lives. She has never asked us for money, never assumed she was entitled to inheritance, and never criticized our choices about charitable giving or community involvement." Harold continued, "Most importantly, Samantha has shown genuine care for other people's well-being, including elderly neighbors, struggling families in her work, and even her parents despite their sometimes harsh criticism of her career choices." The video concluded with their direct explanation of the inheritance decision. "We believe that Samantha will use our wealth responsibly and in ways that honor the values we have tried to instill in our family. We trust her to continue our tradition of community service, employee care, and charitable giving while also securing her own future and providing for any children she may have. Margaret's final words were particularly powerful. We hope that Robert and Linda will come to understand that wealth is a responsibility rather than an entitlement, and that family love should be unconditional rather than dependent on financial expectations. As the video ended, the silence in the conference room was profound and uncomfortable. My parents sat frozen, apparently processing the fact that Harold and Margaret had been observing and documenting their attitudes and comments for years, building a case for inheritance decisions based on moral character rather than family hierarchy. The video had accomplished exactly what my grandparents had intended. It explained their reasoning in terms that couldn't be disputed or mischaracterized, using their own voices and specific examples to justify decisions that might otherwise have seemed arbitrary or unfair. But more importantly, the video had exposed my parents' true attitudes about money, family obligations, and moral priorities in ways that would make it impossible for them to deny or rationalize their behavior. Harold and Margaret had created a permanent record of observations that revealed character flaws my parents had apparently not realized were so obvious and problematic to the people who knew them best. The immediate aftermath of watching Harold and Margaret's video was a silence so profound that I could hear the air conditioning system cycling in Mr. Peterson's conference room. My parents sat motionless, faces cycling through shock, embarrassment, anger, and what looked like dawning recognition that their private attitudes about inheritance and family wealth had been documented and exposed by the very people they had expected to benefit from. Dad was the first to speak, his voice tight with defensive anger. "This is character assassination. Our private family conversations are being used to justify cutting us out of our own parents' estate." Mom's reaction was more emotional but equally defensive. Harold and Margaret recorded that video when they were elderly and possibly not thinking clearly. Those comments were taken out of context and twisted to make us look greedy and selfish. Mr. Peterson responded calmly but firmly, "Mr. and Mrs. Chen, I can assure you that Harold and Margaret were of completely sound mind when they recorded this message. They spent months discussing their observations and their estate planning decisions, and they were very clear about their reasoning." Aunt Sarah, who had been silent during the video, finally spoke with obvious discomfort about what she had just heard. "Robert, Linda, I have to say that some of those comments Harold and Margaret quoted do sound like things I've heard you say at family gatherings. The remarks about the vacation home and retirement planning based on inheritance money were pretty specific." Uncle Tom nodded in agreement. "I remember feeling uncomfortable during some of those conversations because it seemed like you were counting on Harold and Margaret's money before they were even gone." The validation from other family members seemed to increase my parents' defensiveness and anger, as they realized that their attitudes about inheritance had been noticed and discussed by multiple family members beyond just Harold and Margaret. "We loved Harold and Margaret," Dad said, his voice becoming more aggressive. "We spent time with them, included them in family activities, and showed them respect and care throughout their lives. We weren't perfect, but we were good children who deserved to be treated fairly in their estate planning." "Fairly?" I said, speaking for the first time since the video had ended. "Mom, Dad, you just heard Grandma and Grandpa explain in their own words why they made the decisions they did. They weren't punishing you, they were choosing to give their wealth to someone they believed would use it responsibly and in ways that honored their values." Mom's response revealed the depth of her anger and sense of entitlement. "Samantha, you manipulated two elderly people into leaving you money that rightfully belongs to their son. You spent time with them and acted like the perfect granddaughter while undermining our relationship with them." The accusation of manipulation was both hurtful and revealing about how my parents understood family relationships. In their minds, the only explanation for Harold and Margaret's decision was deliberate scheming rather than genuine affection and moral assessment. I need to pause here because what happened next was absolutely incredible and showed exactly how far my parents were willing to go when their sense of entitlement was threatened. You're probably thinking you know how greedy parents react when they don't get the inheritance they expected, but their response was even more extreme than you can imagine. The way they tried to pressure me into giving up money that wasn't theirs was shocking, and their final ultimatum revealed character flaws that made my grandparents' decision look even more wise. Subscribe because the family drama that followed was absolutely unbelievable. "That's not true," I replied as calmly as I could manage. "I spent time with Grandma and Grandpa because I loved them and enjoyed their company. I never discussed inheritance with them, never asked them for money, and never even knew about their will until today. But my parents had apparently moved beyond rational discussion into damage control mode and financial planning based on their assumption that they could pressure or manipulate me into sharing the inheritance they felt they deserved. Dad's approach became calculating and transactional. Samantha, you're 25 years old with no experience managing large amounts of money. $26 million is an enormous responsibility that could ruin your life if you make poor decisions. Your mother and I have years of experience with investments and financial planning that could help you make smart choices about this inheritance. Mom added her own version of the same argument. Sweetheart, we're not saying you don't deserve anything from Harold and Margaret's estate. But keeping all $26 million for yourself would be selfish and unrealistic. The responsible thing would be to share this windfall with the family members who helped care for your grandparents and who have more experience with money management. Their sudden shift to concern about my inexperience with wealth management was transparent and manipulative, especially since they had never previously shown interest in mentoring my financial decisions or had expressed concerns about my money management skills. Mom, Dad, I appreciate your concerns about my ability to handle this responsibility, I said carefully, but Grandma and Grandpa obviously believed I was capable of managing their estate appropriately. I plan to honor their trust by using this inheritance wisely and in ways that reflect their values. The response to my refusal to immediately share the inheritance was swift and revealing. Instead of accepting my decision or offering genuine support for the responsibility I had inherited, my parents moved directly into ultimatum mode. Samantha, Dad said with cold finality, if you're going to be selfish and greedy about this inheritance, then you're not the daughter we raised and you're not welcome in our family anymore. Mom nodded in agreement. We've supported you financially and emotionally throughout your life, and this is how you repay us, by keeping money that should be shared with the people who actually earned it through years of caring for Harold and Margaret. The threats were both shocking and illuminating about their true priorities and understanding of family relationships. Rather than supporting me during a difficult time or celebrating my grandparents' confidence in my character, they were punishing me for receiving an inheritance they believed they deserved more than I did. Are you seriously disowning me because I won't give you money that my grandparents specifically chose not to leave you? I asked, hoping they would recognize how their ultimatum sounded when stated directly. But they had apparently crossed a line that made rational discussion impossible, and their response confirmed that their love and acceptance had always been more conditional than I had realized. If you change your mind and decide to do the right thing, Dad said as we all prepared to leave Mr. Peterson's office, you know where to find us. But until then, don't expect us to pretend that you're still part of our family. As I drove home from the law office that afternoon, I felt a mixture of grief, anger, and strange relief about the confrontation that had just redefined my family relationships. Harold and Margaret's inheritance had given me financial security I had never imagined, but it had also cost me the relationship with parents who had apparently never loved me unconditionally. More importantly, the video my grandparents had recorded had proven that their assessment of family character had been accurate and prophetic. Their decision to leave their wealth to me rather than to my parents had been vindicated by the exact responses they had apparently anticipated and prepared for. In the days following our confrontation at Mr. Peterson's office, my parents launched what could only be described as a systematic campaign to pressure me into sharing the inheritance while simultaneously destroying my reputation within our extended family and social circles. Their approach was methodical, manipulative, and designed to isolate me from support systems while painting themselves as victims of my greed and ingratitude. The campaign began with phone calls to every relative, family friend, and social contact they could reach, spreading their version of events and soliciting support for their position that I should do the right thing and share Harold and Margaret's estate with the family members who deserved it more than I did. Samantha has become consumed with greed, Mom told my Aunt Sarah during a call I later learned about. She's forgotten everything we taught her about family loyalty and sharing blessings with the people who helped raise her. Dad's approach was more calculating and focused on undermining confidence in my character and judgment. We're worried that $26 million is going to corrupt Samantha and destroy the values Harold and Margaret tried to instill in her. She's already showing signs of selfishness and entitlement that we've never seen before. Their characterization of my response to the inheritance was both inaccurate and strategically designed to make me appear as if I had changed from a loving granddaughter into a selfish heiress who had forgotten her family obligations. They were rewriting the history of our relationships and my character to support their narrative that I was undeserving of Harold and Margaret's trust and confidence. The extended family members who knew me well were skeptical of my parents' campaign, recognizing that their version of events didn't align with their own observations of my character and values over the years. Uncle Tom called me directly after receiving one of Dad's phone calls. "Samantha, I want you to know that I don't believe what Robert is saying about you becoming greedy or forgetting your family. I've watched you prioritize service over money your entire adult life, and I don't think inheriting money would suddenly change who you are." Aunt Sarah was similarly supportive. "Honey, I was there when Harold and Margaret's video played, and I heard their explanations for their decision. Your parents are angry and hurt, but they're not being fair to you or honest about their own behavior that led to this situation." But my parents' campaign extended beyond family members to social circles, church communities, and professional contacts who had less detailed knowledge of our family dynamics and were more susceptible to their narrative about my supposed transformation from generous granddaughter to selfish heiress. At church, where Harold and Margaret had been beloved members and where many people had attended their funeral, my parents spread stories about how I was hoarding money that should be used for family support and community benefit. Harold and Margaret would be heartbroken to see how their inheritance has changed Samantha, Mom told members of the church's women's ministry. They raised her to be generous and community-minded, but now she's keeping all their money for herself instead of sharing it with family and charity. The irony of these comments was staggering, considering that Harold and Margaret's video had specifically praised my character and service orientation while criticizing my parents' attitudes toward charitable giving and community support. But people who hadn't seen the video had no context for evaluating the accuracy of Mom's characterizations. Dad focused his campaign on professional and business contacts, spreading concern about my inexperience with wealth management and my poor judgment about family responsibilities. "We're worried that Samantha is going to make terrible financial decisions and lose everything Harold and Margaret worked for," he told people at the country club where my grandparents had been members. "She's too young and naive to handle this kind of responsibility, but she won't listen to family advice." The professional undermining was particularly damaging because it could affect my career in social work, where reputation for judgment and character was essential for effectiveness and advancement. Colleagues and clients who heard these concerns might begin questioning my professionalism and decision-making capabilities. But the most hurtful aspect of my parents' campaign was their decision to completely cut me off from family contact and support during a time when I was grieving my grandparents' deaths while adjusting to responsibilities I had never anticipated. When I tried calling to discuss the situation rationally, they refused to take my calls. When I sent letters explaining my position and requesting family unity despite our disagreements, they returned them unopened. When I reached out through other family members who might serve as mediators, they made it clear that reconciliation was impossible unless I agreed to share the inheritance according to their demands. "Your parents have made their position very clear," Uncle Tom reported after attempting to mediate a conversation between us. "They believe you owe them at least half of Harold and Margaret's estate, and they're not willing to discuss any other arrangement." The financial demands had actually escalated since our initial confrontation, apparently based on their assumption that pressure and isolation would make me more willing to negotiate. Instead of asking for sharing the inheritance, they were now demanding specific amounts that would fund their retirement, vacation home purchase, and lifestyle improvements they had been planning based on inheritance expectations. Robert told me they need at least $13 million to achieve their financial goals, Aunt Sarah reported with obvious discomfort about being put in the middle of our family conflict. They seemed to think Samantha should be grateful to keep half of what Harold and Margaret left her. The escalating demands revealed the extent to which my parents had been counting on Harold and Margaret's money to fund their future plans, and how little consideration they had given to the possibility that estate planning might reflect moral assessments rather than automatic family inheritance traditions. But perhaps the most telling aspect of their campaign was their complete inability to acknowledge or address the behavioral examples Harold and Margaret had cited in their video explanation. Instead of recognizing that their attitudes about inheritance and family wealth might have been problematic, they focused entirely on attacking my character and demanding financial accommodation. The campaign created social pressure and family division that was emotionally exhausting and professionally challenging. But it also strengthened my resolve to honor Harold and Margaret's trust by using their inheritance responsibly rather than capitulating to pressure from people who had demonstrated exactly the character flaws my grandparents had been concerned about. Most importantly, my parents' response to the inheritance situation was providing ongoing validation of Harold and Margaret's decision to leave their wealth to someone they believed would use it according to their values rather than someone who felt entitled to it based on family hierarchy. 2 weeks after the initial will reading, our extended family gathered for a memorial reception at the church where Harold and Margaret had been lifelong members. The reception was intended as a celebration of their lives and an opportunity for community members to share memories and express appreciation for my grandparents' contributions to the church and the broader community. My parents attended the reception despite our ongoing estrangement, apparently deciding that their public role as grieving children was more important than their private anger about the inheritance situation. They circulated through the gathering accepting condolences and sharing stories about Harold and Margaret's lives, playing their parts as loving family members while simultaneously continuing their campaign to undermine my reputation among church members and family friends. The reception provided them with a captive audience of people who had known and respected my grandparents, and they used the opportunity to spread their narrative about my supposed greed and ingratitude in subtle but persistent ways. We're still hoping Samantha will reconsider her decision and honor Harold and Margaret's true wishes about sharing their blessings with the entire family, Mom told a group of church women who had asked about our family's well-being after the loss. Dad's approach was more indirect but equally manipulative. Harold and Margaret always emphasized the importance of family unity and supporting each other through difficult times. We hope those values will prevail despite the challenges we're currently facing. Their comments were carefully crafted to sound noble and generous while implying that I was the source of family division and moral failure. People who hadn't seen Harold and Margaret's video explanation had no context for understanding that my parents' version of events was incomplete and self-serving. But I had decided that the memorial reception would be the perfect opportunity to share Harold and Margaret's own words about their estate planning decisions with the community members who had known and respected them for decades. If my parents were going to continue their campaign of character assassination using Harold and Margaret's memory as justification, then those same people deserved to hear what my grandparents had actually said about their family observations and moral assessments. I had worked with the church's audiovisual team to set up equipment that would allow me to play Harold and Margaret's video message during the reception program. The church leadership had agreed to include the video as part of the formal memorial presentation, understanding that it would provide insight into Harold and Margaret's values and final wishes that would be meaningful to the community members who had loved them. The reception program included traditional elements like shared memories, readings from Harold and Margaret's favorite scriptures, and musical selections that reflected their faith and values. But the centerpiece would be the video message they had recorded, which most of the attendees had never seen or heard about. Pastor Williams introduced the video segment by explaining that Harold and Margaret had recorded a message about their values and hopes for their family's future, and that sharing it would help everyone understand the principles that had guided their lives and their final decisions. As the video began playing on the large screen at the front of the church fellowship hall, the room became completely quiet. Community members who had known Harold and Margaret for decades were hearing their voices again, sharing their thoughts about family relationships, moral responsibilities, and the proper use of wealth and resources. The video's impact on the reception audience was immediate and profound. People who had heard my parents' version of events about inheritance disputes and family greed were now hearing Harold and Margaret's own explanations for their estate planning decisions, complete with specific examples of the attitudes and comments that had influenced their choices. When Harold quoted my father's remarks about buying a vacation home, once the inheritance comes through, several church members turned to look at my parents with expressions of surprise and disappointment. When Margaret described my parents' criticism of their charitable giving as money that could be better utilized for family benefit, the contrast with Harold and Margaret's well-known generosity became stark and uncomfortable. But the most powerful moments came when Harold and Margaret spoke about my character and values, praising my choice to pursue social work despite parental pressure for more lucrative careers, and acknowledging my consistent demonstration of service, integrity, and compassion that aligned with their own moral priorities. As the video concluded with their explanation that I would use their wealth responsibly and in ways that honored their values, the reception audience was left with a clear understanding of why Harold and Margaret had made their inheritance decisions and what their assessment of various family members' characters had been. The silence that followed the video was profound and uncomfortable, particularly for my parents who were now sitting in a room full of people who had just heard their own words quoted as examples of inappropriate attitudes toward inheritance and family wealth. Pastor Williams, clearly moved by Harold and Margaret's message, addressed the gathering with comments that validated their character assessments and moral reasoning. Harold and Margaret have given us a gift in sharing their thoughts about values, family relationships, and the responsible use of resources. Their message reminds us that wealth is indeed a responsibility rather than an entitlement, and that our characters are revealed through how we treat others and what we do with the blessings we receive. The reception continued with small group conversations, but the dynamic had been fundamentally altered by Harold and Margaret's video message. People who had previously been sympathetic to my parents' narrative about inheritance disputes were now viewing the situation through the lens of my grandparents' own observations and explanations. Mrs. Thompson, who had been one of Margaret's closest friends at church, approached me with tears in her eyes. "Samantha, dear, your grandparents were so proud of you and so confident in your character." Hearing them explain their decision in their own words makes it clear that they chose wisely. Mr. Davis, who had worked with Harold on church financial committees for years, expressed similar sentiments. Harold always said that the measure of a person's character was how they treated others when they had power or resources. It's clear that he and Margaret saw that character in you and wanted to ensure their wealth would be used according to their values. The validation from community members who had known and respected Harold and Margaret for decades was emotionally overwhelming but also liberating. For the first time since the inheritance situation had begun, I felt supported by people who understood my grandparents' reasoning and respected their judgment about family character and moral priorities. But the most significant impact was on my parents, who found themselves in a room full of people who had just heard objective evidence that their attitudes about inheritance and family wealth were exactly as problematic as Harold and Margaret had described. Their campaign to portray themselves as victims of my greed had been completely undermined by my grandparents' own words about their character observations and moral assessments. Dad's face had gone pale during the video, and he remained silent throughout the remainder of the reception, apparently recognizing that any attempt to defend or explain his quoted comments would only make the situation worse. Mom tried to maintain her composure, but I could see the embarrassment and anger in her expression as community members offered condolences that now carried undertones of judgment about her family priorities. As the reception concluded, several family friends and church members approached me privately to express support and understanding about the inheritance situation that had been creating family tension. "Samantha, your grandparents were wise people who understood character and values better than most," said Dr. Martinez, who had been Harold's longtime physician and friend. "Trust their judgment about you and don't let anyone make you feel guilty for receiving recognition of your integrity and service orientation." The reception had accomplished exactly what I had hoped. It had allowed Harold and Margaret to speak for themselves about their estate planning decisions, providing community context that validated their reasoning while exposing the character flaws that had motivated their choices. More importantly, it had demonstrated that my grandparents' assessment of family dynamics had been accurate and that their concerns about certain family members' attitudes toward wealth and moral responsibility were shared by other people who had known our family for years. In the months following the memorial reception where Harold and Margaret's video message was shared publicly, the entire dynamic of our family conflict and community relationships shifted dramatically in ways that validated my grandparents' character assessments while creating accountability for behaviors they had found concerning. My parents' campaign to portray me as greedy and ungrateful collapsed completely once community members heard Harold and Margaret's own explanations for their inheritance decisions. Church friends, business associates, and extended family members who had initially been sympathetic to my parents' narrative began distancing themselves as they understood the full context of the estate planning situation. After hearing Harold and Margaret's video, I realized that Robert and Linda's version of events wasn't accurate or complete, Aunt Sarah told me during one of our conversations about family dynamics. "Your grandparents clearly put a lot of thought into their decisions, and their reasoning makes sense when you hear it directly from them." Uncle Tom was even more direct in his assessment. "I'm embarrassed that I initially thought you should consider sharing the inheritance to keep peace in the family." Harold and Margaret's video made it clear that they specifically didn't want their wealth going to people with those attitudes about money and family obligations. The social consequences for my parents were swift and comprehensive. Their country club friends began treating them with cooler politeness after hearing about Harold and Margaret's quoted comments regarding their assumptions about inheritance funding their lifestyle plans. Church members who had previously respected their financial success started questioning their values and priorities after learning about their criticism of Harold and Margaret's charitable giving. Most significantly, their professional reputations suffered as word spread about their sense of entitlement regarding their parents' estate and their treatment of the daughter who had been chosen as beneficiary. In a community where Harold and Margaret had been respected for decades, being exposed as people who had taken their generosity for granted while planning to spend their money before they were even gone created lasting damage to Robert and Linda's standing. But the most satisfying aspect of the situation was watching Harold and Margaret's wisdom about character assessment prove accurate in ways they probably couldn't have anticipated. Instead of apologizing for the attitudes that had influenced their parents' inheritance decisions or attempting to repair relationships based on genuine recognition of their mistakes, my parents doubled down on their sense of victimhood and entitlement. Dad's response to the community reaction was to blame me for airing family business in public, rather than acknowledging that his own quoted words had created the negative impression people had formed about his character. Samantha humiliated us by playing that video at the church reception, he told people who would still listen to his complaints. She violated family privacy to make us look bad and justify keeping money that belongs to the whole family. Mom's approach was similar, focusing on the exposure of their private attitudes rather than examining whether those attitudes might have been problematic in the first place. Harold and Margaret recorded that video when they were elderly and influenced by Samantha's manipulation, she continued to claim despite all evidence to the contrary. She's using their words against us to cover up her own greed and selfishness. Their inability to acknowledge or learn from the situation provided ongoing validation that Harold and Margaret's concerns about their character had been well-founded and their inheritance decisions had been wise. Meanwhile, I was discovering that my grandparents had been correct in their assessment that I would use their wealth responsibly and in ways that honored their values and legacy. The inheritance allowed me to establish a charitable foundation focused on supporting social services, educational opportunities, and community development programs that reflected Harold and Margaret's lifetime of generous giving. The foundation's first major project was funding a community center in Harold and Margaret's name that would provide after-school programs, job training services, and support for families facing financial hardship. The center served exactly the kind of community needs my grandparents had cared about throughout their lives, and it created a lasting memorial to their values that was more meaningful than any building or monument could have been. I also used the inheritance to continue my social work career without financial pressure, allowing me to take positions with nonprofits and community organizations that aligned with my values rather than jobs that simply provided the highest salaries. The financial security gave me freedom to pursue meaningful work that made positive differences in people's lives, exactly as Harold and Margaret had hoped when they explained their trust in my character and priorities. But perhaps the most important outcome was the peace I found in understanding that Harold and Margaret had seen and appreciated my character in ways that had motivated them to entrust me with continuing their legacy of service and generosity. Their inheritance wasn't just money. It was recognition and validation of values I had learned from them and a responsibility to use resources for purposes that would make them proud. Looking back on this incredible journey from inheritance shock to family betrayal to perfect vindication, I realized that my grandparents gave me much more than money. They gave me proof that someone had seen my character clearly and found it worthy of their trust. Their video didn't just explain their estate planning, it showed the world exactly who my parents really were when they thought no one important was watching. Have you ever dealt with family members who felt entitled to money that wasn't theirs? How do you handle relatives who show their true colors when financial inheritance is involved? I'd love to hear your stories about family greed and the ways money reveals people's real character and priorities. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. I share more stories about family dynamics, inheritance battles, and the ways financial situations expose people's true values and moral priorities. Ring that notification bell so you don't miss any new videos, and share this with anyone who might need to hear that sometimes the best inheritance is the validation that someone saw your worth. Thank you for watching and for all the support you show by engaging with these videos. Remember that true family love is unconditional and doesn't come with financial expectations attached. Sometimes the most generous thing you can do is honor the wishes of people who believed in your character, even when others question their judgment. Take care of yourselves, trust the people who see your true value, and remember that the best revenge against family greed is simply living up to the faith that people placed in you. I'll see you in the next video, and until then, keep building the legacy that makes the people who loved you proud.